know why I thought that.
Should we do introductions before we get started?
Just a really quick reminder, can everybody make sure their cell phone's off? Even if you think it is, just take it out and double check it just to make sure.
She, her pronouns, Prime Minister from BARD.
My name is Anya Berkowitz, she, her pronouns. I will be the member of government. Verbal POIs, verbal POCs.
I second that.
Yeah, verbal things.
My name is Xander Deutsch. I'm going to be the first and third speaker for Menlo-Atherton. Opposition side, I use he, him pronouns.
Shawnee Shivakumar is going to be the second opposition speaker, he, him pronouns as well.
All right, is everyone ready? Okay. My time begins on my first word. Because government side is the middle ground in this debate, I could not be prouder to affirm a few things in this speech. First, some definitions, then some framing, then 3 reasons why you should always be affirming the motion. So first, on a framework, we propose utilitarianism or net benefits for this nation or this city or whatever we're talking about, this country, for example. Okay, and then some framing on what government side looks like. We see that government world still has urban development. We just don't have it in the extreme nature that you see on opposition side of the house. This means that we still develop urban areas, but we also have some spread into suburban areas and rural areas as well, which, as I'm going to get into later on, is extremely important to have a stable country. Our first contention here is all about divide. First subpoint under this contention is all about cultural divide. We see that huge urban cities create cultural hubs that are largely disconnected from the rest of the country. We see that distinctly different viewpoints end up occurring in this area, and it leads to an echo chamber of ideas that are not necessarily being expressed in the rest of the country. This is really, really bad for 2 reasons. First of all, we see that it increases polarization in developing countries. As cities become more cosmopolitan, they develop more liberal ideology that clashes with the old. And as I'm going to get into my second point, it's really, really bad because it's coupled with this idea of elitism. We see that when these cosmopolitan areas are being developed at a far higher rate than their rural counterparts, this leads to a sort of elitism being formed in these areas. Why is this? Because there's more economic growth, because there's more opportunity, because they see themselves as quote unquote, yes.
Sorry, what exactly do you mean when you like reference elitism? Like in the sense, what does it mean?
Oh, that they just think they're better than their rural counterparts.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So we see this leads to like a sense of superiority, and we can even see this at some marginal levels in our society, even today in the US, even though we don't have like these big primate cities. This happens when we see like, for example, everyone here, at least from my knowledge, is from either the east or west coast, where we see predominantly more economic growth than in the middle of the country. When we put this on such an extreme scale of a primate city, we see this exemplified. There's only economic growth in one area. They think they're better than their rural, maybe quote unquote backwards counterparts, when that's not necessarily true. Couple that with increasing this new ideologies that are formed, this leads to just a lot of clash. It leads to a lot of polarization in a country that is developing. This is bad because you end up with political gridlock. You don't get a lot done. We can see this in South Korea right now with the ousting of their last president, in that there's so much clash between the younger and older generations, the people who live in Seoul and people who live in the rest of the country, as they fight over what to do in the country rather than getting anything done overall, which is really bad. Okay, second subpoint under this contention is all about the economic divide. We see that it only leads to one economic hub, and this is bad because it uniquely sucks out resources from the rural areas. Instead of developing, can I pause time?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay, that was really weird. Okay, resuming time in 3, 2, 1. Because you only get economic development, or most economic development, in one area, you aren't investing in new resources in rural areas at the same rate. This leads to a decline in these rural areas that leads to less social mobility in these areas because people aren't starting businesses, they aren't making new opportunities, they don't have enough jobs. This leads to a really bad social mobility decline in rural areas, and it also leads to mass migration to these primate cities that ultimately is really, really bad because it leads to housing crisis in these cities. We see when there's so much mass migration, there's not enough homes for everyone to live in. There's not enough places for them to live. This leads to homelessness as it cannot support all of the incoming residents. And we can see this happening specifically in China as the homelessness rates are rising. I believe it's around like 2.3 million for just in cities alone, rising, which is really, really bad. Second contention here is all about population crisis. We see that when you have a large primate city, people are flooding into the city in large amounts. I talked about this earlier, but because there's not enough accommodation, and the accommodation that is available is just on the smaller side, smaller apartments, people are squeezing into one area just to live there to be able to have this economic opportunity. This leads to a declining in the birth rate of the country because there's not enough space to have children in the first place. So because of this, you end up having less children overall, which leads to declining birth rates. We can see this in China and Korea specifically, and this leads to unsustainable practices where you just don't have enough people, not enough of a youth population to support the aging population, and this also leads to a decline in social security in the future where there's a crisis where people aren't paying into it enough. Then our third contention here is all about stability. We see when you have more of a spread of economic development, the country is just going to be more stable in general. You're able to have less extreme, or in extreme circumstances, be able to still survive as a country. For example, if there's a natural disaster and your one primate city gets wiped out, you still are able to sustain yourself as a country. Or if there's a terrorist attack, you are still able to sustain yourself as a country. And most importantly, you're able to fend off foreign invasion, which probably is more likely to happen in developing countries where there might be some instability in the government. We see this specifically with Afghanistan and Kabul. Whoever controls Kabul controls the entire country. We don't want this to happen. And ultimately, you're just going to have a better country overall if you're able to develop all parts of it instead of just going straight for this one primate city. And for all those reasons, I could not be prouder to affirm.
Good speech. Are judges okay with off-time roadmaps before I begin? I'm going to be going down some top-of-case observations, then onto the two disadvantages, and then finally onto my opponent's case. Is anybody not ready? My time begins in 3, 2, 1. There's two main things that are worth looking at the top of a case. First, what does actively discouraging mean? We tell you this looks like government policies which actually push away other foreign investment in other groups from building up in one centralized area. In other words, literally pushing away development and putting in place protectionist policies that prevent this concentration of wealth. The second thing is that we tell you that as opposition, it is not that we actively encourage it. We simply promote the natural balance of such. Why does this, again, matter? You do not have to vote opposition. To vote opposition, you do not have to entirely believe that it is actually, that they should encourage it. Rather, you just have to believe that actively discouraging it is the worst thing. That said, let's move to the disadvantages. The disadvantage number 1 is that of growth collapse. I repeat, growth collapse. The thesis is that discouraging primate cities kills national growth and prevents long-term prosperity. The warrants are number 1, GDP growth. According to the UN Habitat, primate cities in developing countries contribute on average 40% of GDP, despite only having 12 to 20% of the population. Look to Bangkok, which produces more than 60% of Thailand's GDP, or Jakarta, which is more than 55%, and Lima, which is over 58% of Peru, though this is all according to World Bank data. These cities generate economies of such scale in the forms of because they have transport and other things all central, which is key to productivity. The second thing you can look at is network effects. You can look to the Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh City as nearly all major tech manufacturing occurs there. When you look at foreign direct investment, or FDI, over 70% of Samsung's investment is clustered there. They rely on tight supply chains, skilled labor, only available in these dense established hubs. The third point is spreading out fails, right? We tell you that Nigeria's 2020 decentralization push led to billions in stalled factory investments as firms refuse to locate to underdeveloped zones. The fourth is that of migration. McKinsey finds that increased internal migration raises household income significantly, and access to public goods such as schools and healthcare also go up. The fifth point is precedent, right? The World Bank wrote a whole paper in 2022 that no country has escaped the middle income trap without a globally competitive metropolitan region. You do not have to listen to me. You can listen to people who are far more qualified. Then you can look to the fact that without primate cities, countries can't reach critical mass for innovation, services, or exports. The impacts of this are twofold. First, this leads to mass poverty. With each 1% drop in GDP growth pushes 1.7 million people into extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. The second is that of structural unemployment. Youth people entering the weak, low-density labor markets can't find jobs. There's no quality of life for these people, and they're never able to feed their family because they can't put income on the table. This leads to my second disadvantage, which is that of environmental degradation and public health collapse. I repeat, environmental degradation and public health collapse. The claim is that discouraging primate cities leads to a fragmented, low-density urban sprawl, which causes higher pollution, weaker healthcare access, and massive long-term public health harm, especially for the marginalized people. The warnings for this are, number one, dense cities are healthier and more sustainable on the net. Concentrated urban areas support efficient public transit, shared healthcare infrastructure, and better air regulation on the net. Decentralizing urban growth increases vehicle reliance, construction emissions, and surface level pollution. The second is that sprawl impacts pollution exposure. We tell you that low density development leads to longer commutes, increased fossil fuel reliance, and a higher rate of PM 2.5 particulate pollution. This is what leads to illness, respiratory diseases, and child development harms. If you want to look at an example of this, look to Bangladesh, in which they have multiple decentralized cities, and they still have such high rates of this PM 2.5, which has led to so many negative health consequences. The third point is decentralized healthcare systems underserve remote communities. Building out mid-sized cities instead of one strong city spreads doctors, nurses, clinics, emergency services, vaccination requirements all thin. We tell you that this is inherently bad because it reduces response time and the service quality of healthcare throughout a country. The fourth is fragmented cities can't manage environmental threats. Dispersed populations make it harder to build centralized water treatments, waste disposals, and vehicle transits. This leads to an increased risk of flooding, disease, and heat-related deaths. The fifth point is that the government creates a perfect storm for future pandemics. We tell you that weak health networks plus bad air quality plus slower response times means faster disease spread and slower state response. This is super important. State response is much slower if there's multiple cities rather than one central one. You can look to Seoul as a fantastic example of this. They were able to handle the COVID pandemic much easier because the Korean government knew that they could focus on the big city and as a result didn't have to have slower response time across many other ones. The impacts are threefold. One, that a preventable death goes down because you actually don't have to build as many cities. Second, there's higher health costs in a government world because you have to spread all of these resources thin. And third is that there's overall an environmental decline in terms of, and we reach we trigger this death scenario and this extinction scenario faster. That said, let's move on to my opponent's case. To overview the case, we think that this divide is A, largely not gonna happen, and B, it's very bad for the city overall. So let's start with this cultural divide point. They talk about how it increases polarization, but they never tell you the comparative of this. What is the alternative if everyone lives in their own little villages or their own communities and there's no actual political clash? We see this as worse political outcomes for people because there's not as good of a government which is built up of a coalition of the most amount of people. Rather, if there were a bunch of fragmented cities, the leaders of it would just come from whichever city had the closest proximity to it, or whichever was established as the capital. This is bad. We think that political clash is probably a good thing. It promotes the furthering of ideas. And to the extent they say it leads to elitism, they don't do the crucial point for you, Judge, which is, why do you care? Even if it maybe does lead to some people thinking they're better in cities, that doesn't lead to any negative consequences for people living in rural communities. Again, we tell you that even then, it's not that unique because we tell you that in both worlds we see that there probably is this elitism that builds up. Then they talk about how there's a political, Then they talk about economic divide, and they say most economic development is in more areas. directly cross-apply our own case, which tells you that when you have these centralized cities, they contribute more to the GDP of a country, even with less population. So you can turn this entire economic divide point, even to the point that like spread out infrastructures, turn off like foreign investment, and lead to like much less of it. Then on the advantage number 2, they talk about like population crisis and declining birth rates as there's not enough people. The examples they give for this are China, which is like obviously problematic because that was a state-backed like policy which led like the one-child policy, which actually led to this problem. It wasn't because they had like primate cities, which is why. But even then, you can look at the fact that like every other one of these cities or these countries like Thailand and like these other nations and like South Korea don't suffer from these same issues. So we tell you that like on the net, population is not necessarily correlated. And even then, gut check this. If you have bigger cities with more people centralized in them, that is a recipe towards more people having like getting together. And then we tell you that like the housing crisis in cities actually solves for itself, because if it's like so big that people are gonna like can't afford prices, then generally you see that like they're just not gonna move to that city. So we think this is largely like not a big point. Finally on stability, they say you still like survive if there's one terrorist attack. We just don't think this is true because of the idea that there's state control. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Order is going to go. Okay. Order is going to go off case, go case, minus time. We'll start in that order. We think what the observation side is skewing what this front is about. It isn't as if all the potential growth happening in these countries can only happen in primate cities. The development becomes more diverse in the world. Okay. Now let's talk about their first 2 observations on top of the case. They tell you that we're actually actively discouraging investors. Turn this, no, because if we have more cities that are more diverse, investors are more likely to think this is a stable place to invest, because if the city collapses, then what happens? And all my investments are gone. But if the city collapses in GovWorld, we see that there are multiple cities, therefore they're going to invest more. They tell you that this is probably the most important response here. They tell you that like, oh, we're going to actively encourage natural balance. We tell you that actively encouraging natural balance leads to the status quo in developing cities, developing countries where there is this one primate city. Why is this? Because we see it's pretty easy. It's easy to build up just one city and not focus on the rest of the country. It's easy to leave out these parts of the world. It's easier to just build up one city and not focus about the rest. That's why we actively have to counter against it. Okay, now on their first contention about growth collapse, on this idea of GDP growth, there's one big mischaracterization that is happening throughout OpCase, where they give you this characterization that GovWorld is one where there's a bunch of sprawled out cities. There's really no link for why GovWorld is sprawled out cities, so don't buy any of the uniqueness on that. But then also, we see that like, why can't we have, even if we did have spread out cities, why wouldn't the GDP be higher in spread out cities? They don't give uniqueness. Sorry, I don't have a lot of time. Okay, then they tell you that like there's network effects and that they're only available in like dense areas. This is because of the status quo. Then on this idea of like migration, this only happens in the short term and not on the long term. On the example for the USA of sprawled out cities, look to New York City and LA. You have more specialized cities, more specific development, or you have international hub. Okay, then on this idea of like mass poverty and structural unemployment, we tell you this happens more and not because we see this idea of mass immigration. Okay, on their C2 of environmental degradation and the health collapse, they tell you, like, once again, there's this idea, there's low density, there's urban sprawl. We tell you that's not true. Look to the East Coast. The East Coast has, you know, multiple cities. We do not have a primate city. We have Boston, we have New York City, we have Philly, we have DC. What happens here? We see there the beautiful upstate, the beautiful Saratoga, the beautiful Catskills Mountains. These are very beautiful mountains. Just because we don't have, like, just because we have multiple cities doesn't mean that everything in between is just like California and the Bay Area. No offense to Bay Area people, but I understand that, you know, that's the perception of what sprawled out cities look like. No, we see in the East Coast that this isn't the only option. They give you no uniqueness for why it's going to be sprawled out cities. Okay, but then, then on this idea of longer commutes, they're talking about the urban sprawl here that doesn't have to happen. Okay, and then they tell you like mid-sized cities spread doctors out. That's not what happens. We have more cities of smaller size. Look to the East Coast where we have like, you know, we have really centralized areas, and then we have really nice mountains. So we have like Boston where all these doctors are in. Then we have New York City. It's not like the doctors, you know, people are suffering in, you know, Saugerties, New York because they can't drive to New York City, which is a 3-hour drive away. That's probably fine. There's a really good infrastructure there. They'll be fine. Okay. Then on this idea of future pandemics, we think turn this, it's uniquely harder to actually enforce any type of pandemic reinforcement insofar as when you have a decentralized state where you have this one big primate city and there's really nothing else, then you see that like it's really hard to enforce because you don't have much control over the rural areas. The rural areas are culturally different from you. They're economically different from you. When you come in there and you say, when you come in there and you say, oh, basically, I'm your big government from the city and I want to tell you how to rule, how to follow these procedures for COVID-19, they're basically going to say, F off, I don't like this. This is, you're, culturally elite. You think you're better than me because you live in the place of economic development. That's probably really bad. On this idea of healthcare and climate change, we think this is probably non-unique. Healthcare only being given in urban primate places causes an extreme less of it in the rural areas. When there is more suburban and smaller cities, this leads to more access to healthcare. Also, when there are more smaller cities, there's more likely to be more public infrastructure built around connecting them. Instead of just, one urban city, then literally, why would you get there? Why would you need to actually go to the urban city? Like, if you live in there probably isn't a lot of, there's probably isn't a lot of infrastructure, like trains, like access to the city, but when we have smaller cities, there's going to be infrastructure to connect those cities. There's going to be ways to access to healthcare. That's going to help the people in the rural areas. Then we see that climate change is less likely to be solved when you heavily industrialize one or two cities because you focus on industry over sustainability. Okay, example of this is like air quality in Seoul is worse than the area in the rural areas. Okay, now let's go to our case. First on this idea of divide, they tell you that the comparative is everyone that's living in their own village. No, the comparative is everyone has smaller cities. Then they say like, oh, the cities are fragmented, or the villages are fragmented, but they give you no warrant for why the cities have to be fragmented. Their entire case and response operates on the assumption that we're just like living in our own separate bubbles. No, we have these smaller interconnected coast cities that we see in the East Coast. Then on this idea of political clash, they tell you that political clash is actually good because, it leads to discourse, but that's the opposite of what we're saying. They're not understanding the link here. The link here is that what we see is that there's no political clash. People don't talk to each other because you see, if you live in the big city, you have these liberal globalized ideas because you see the stock trade, you see the open world society. If you live in this rural town, you might have different opinions, you might have different views because they never interconnect, because their worlds are so divided, something that the opposition side never brings up and therefore concedes to this idea of dividing worlds. We see that they're never going to clash, they're never going to have any sort of conversation, there's no political discourse, vote for Gov here alone. Okay. And then on the economic, they just tell you like cross-apply and contribute more to GDP. We tell you like, okay, they never give a warrant for why these cities are urban sprawl. And then we think this is back to their case, we think their Vietnam example is simply proving our point, as Ho Chi Minh is the major center which immediately knifes their entire economy when Trump does the tariffs. Okay, then on Seoul and the population crisis, the only response we get here is that like, oh, the state backed the one-child policy. But what we see in China is that roughly 3/4 of a percent decline in fertility since 1970 up to the present occurred before the introduction of the one-child policy. We see this in any developing state that has a mass migration to cities. They don't interact with any of the warrants that Mina gives you. By my A, the stats that I give you, that I tell you, 3/4 of the decline in fertility since 1970 up to the present occurred before the introduction of the one-child policy. And B, value my empirics over there just say, oh, one-child policy exists, because I tell you when people move into the cities, what happens? They have less space, they have less, comfortability. Why do they move into the cities? Because they think it's the only option. They have less space, they have less comfortability, they have less children. This leads to population collapse. This leads to extend this point. This leads to, social barriers. This leads to, in like 40 years, you have a population that is like 70% old people. How are you going to support them for social welfare when you have such a small young tax base? This leads to divides, because if you have an increasingly older population voting in people who have different political views than the younger population, that's going to lead to political divide. This is really, really bad for a developing country because you need to be unified. You need to be all on the same page in order to exact your global goals. You can't be divided and fighting about, what the younger civilization wants, what the older civilization wants, or what, this urban civilization wants, and what the rural civilization wants. Okay, then on this idea of like Thailand, they just tell you that like the Thailand and South Korea don't suffer from this. Two responses here. First, Korea clearly suffers from this. Like, they're clearly experiencing a drop in migration. And then two, the only reason that Thailand doesn't suffer, like, to a large extent is Korea, because we tell you they do suffer from this. They never give you any empirics or stats. They just tell you, oh, Thailand doesn't. I don't hear an empiric or a stat. The only reason that Thailand suffers less is because of migration. Okay. They say the housing crisis solves for itself because they don't move to the city. Look to China. This is an empiric and statistic proof that this does not happen, because when you have a primate city, the only opportunity for you is to move to the city, because that's where all the investments do. You move there because you think, I'd rather be homeless getting a job there than live here with no opportunities. And they don't respond to C3 extend that. For all those reasons, I couldn't be prouder to have heard.
Great speech. The order is going to be some framework, the neg, and then the af. Okay, let's go framework, adds, then negs. Adds, then disadds. time is beginning at my first word. When side government comes up here and tells you that all their examples and arguments hold true because of the East Coast, you should probably already vote them down for that reason. Not only A, is the East Coast of the United States probably the most developed country in the entirety of the world, but B, they give literally no other empiric or warrant or country example besides the East Coast, which means they heavily rely on this one example, which doesn't even apply to the round. Then, let's go into the two framing points that Xander notes. First, I want you to extend the fact that this actively discourages and pushes away investors. Why? They say that they can turn this because if there's multiple stable points of investment, then then investors feel more comfortable because there's less points of failure. This fails for two reasons. The first reason here is that even though there's more sprawled out areas, they aren't concentrated and wealth-like cities. I'm going to go into the disadvantages and extend some, but what we tell you here is that no major, and they dropped this, by the World Bank in 2022, no major developing country has not had one massive, giant metropolitan area, which means it's not that it's like it's inevitable at a certain point in time to get past the developing stage, which means that investors see this World Bank report because they're obviously very informed and see that this country doesn't have this big hubs and are less likely to invest. That's one of the reasons why. But the second reason why here is that because they're so sprawled out, there's less interconnectedness. They say they're just going to build railroads and build tracks, but look, we haven't even built high-speed rail in California, one of the biggest, probably industrialized, developed nations in the entirety of the world. They want to build interconnected track networks in the entirety of a developed country. Probably gut check this, doesn't happen very often, leads to isolated, fragmented areas where there isn't good communication between them. It means health supplies get like cut off from one another, and there isn't good communication, which means investors pull out because they aren't confident in the success of a country. That's the framing points. Let's go to the advantages now. First, on divide. The only response to Xander's response to the cultural argument is that the East Coast is wonderful with its mountains and cities. And that, also that there's no political clash because in the cities are all the liberals and in the rural areas are all the Republicans. This is just not true. To the point at which cities are massive ethnic hubs of different religions. We see here that people come together from different backgrounds, different ideologies. We see here the Bay Area, one of the biggest places, sure. Okay, we don't have to use the U.S., but if you just look at general examples, in, for example, Nairobi, you see that multiple people immigrate into that area, which means because it's a big cultural hub, you can see this happening all throughout history. Look to the Silk Road, where people would migrate to massive cities. You would have these caravanserai, where you have multiple different ethnic groups into I took AP World last year, sorry. One different clad, which probably means that throughout history, you can see that when you have big cities, you have different people coming together, which probably means we turn their political clash because you have more different open-minded people and different religions and different backgrounds. This means that under their own world of small fragmented cities with no connection, you see more isolation and more divide and less unity because there isn't this connected network. Then also you can extend the fact that it's elitism is non-unique. They don't extend elitism, so you can just drop the fact that people in rich cities think they're better than others because inevitably there's some sort of divide everywhere. There's no really impact out to this. You can just not consider this in the round. Then on the economic divide, they say that once again, the response is investors are going to see sprawled out cities and they're more likely to invest. I've already made a response to this, just cross-apply that here. And then they say the housing crisis means that you have to live in the city or you can't live anywhere else. This is just not true. Even though there's more housing, there's more projects and public infrastructure projects in the city, there are definitely still housing everywhere else. If you look to, for example, a good example would be, for example, Seoul. The entirety of Korea has multiple different areas where you can live and house. It's not you have to live in Seoul or you can live nowhere else. In fact, the majority of people go to Seoul in order to work in working class jobs or have to work in certain areas, and Seoul is able to fill for that capacity. But for the people that don't want to live there or have different types of jobs, they can live at somewhere else.
Also, the houses cost more because they produce so much more economic.
Yeah, the houses cost more because they produce so much more economic benefit. We say here that overall, when a country is doing better, that it's able to for example, it's very, very attractive because everyone wants to move into Seoul because it's such a large economic hub and it's doing so well. Proves to you that literally a country that has massive economic hubs are doing better than the ones that don't have massive economic hubs. Okay. Then, on population, massive turn. Look to sub-Saharan Africa. I can probably name to you a bunch of Nigeria, for example, has one of the biggest populations in the world. It's the largest growing population, and guess what? They have a massive central economic hub. Look to almost every single country within sub-Saharan Africa because they have massive one hubs within the country. But guess what? Their rates are growing higher and higher, which means we have direct conflicting empirics on this point, which probably means to you that there's external factors besides hubs that are influencing population, like child policies, like culture, because in Asian cultures, it's more likely to have have less children in order to, like, for example, have a smaller household, like a nuclear family. There are things that influence it besides the fact of, like, the hubs, which probably means you aren't voting on this population disadvantage. Instead, you would probably voting neg on the fact that, like, if you come closer together in cities, they drop this, Xander's response, if you come closer together in cities, people are more likely to have, I don't know, take reproductive actions, which probably means that the population goes up when people are closer together. Then, on the consensus 3 about stability, they say extend, but they extend through ink here. Xander already responds to the fact that, like, the state is able to control itself. That means if there's large hubs, they're able to better respond to terrorist attacks because they're more centralized or more organized. If they're more spread out, that means that terrorist groups and other, I don't know, like, this is a very low probability contention anyways, but like, let's say like a country's able to invade us, that means we'd have very, very weak line of defenses everywhere, which is probably bad because you want to have, like, large central groups of, like, power in order to, like, deter large forces. They don't really respond to Xander's point. They don't know they can do responses in the PMR. Now the dishads. The overview to the dishads is there's a lot of things dropped. A lot of things dropped that you can just probably cleanly extend and just win side negatively round. The first thing you can drop here, the first thing they drop here is the World Bank warrant, which I just want to cleanly extend through because it tells you that in history, no country has ever escaped the developing stage without one massive metropolitan hub. Insofar as they concede that this one hub is inevitable and is necessary for a country to get past the developing stage, you can no longer comfortably vote for side affirmation, but you cannot be confident that they're going to pass the developing stage. But the second response here is that, like, the second response here is that of the network effects and the GDP growth, because we tell you that the majority of growth comes from these large cities and doesn't come from these smaller cities and smaller areas because of the fact of the matter that when you have large groups of people in a certain area in a certain city, Samsung and all these other companies are more likely to invest. Look at the fact that Samsung invested in Jakarta because it was such a large tech hub and it was so important. Also, extend the spreading, extend the spreading out fails. They also completely dropped this. I want you to star and underline this. Nigeria tried to implement decentralization policies back in 2020, and guess what? They lost billions of dollars of jobs, billions of dollars, because companies didn't want to move to other, like, local areas and other parts of the country because they knew that the massive economic benefits would happen in the one city and that the country would fail without it. Insofar as they concede this one precedent and this one empiric about Nigeria, and there's no response to it, you can buy with 100% strength of link that as a matter of fact, if you try to decentralize and create more like hubs, you are less likely to succeed, as you see in Nigeria. Therefore, we get the access to the impacts of mass poverty, of low quality of life. 1% drop in GDP leads to 1.7 million people in poverty, probably the highest terminal impact in the round, insofar as poverty takes out your ability to provide for your family, to feed your family, and that leads to just mass famine in these countries. On disad 2, but environment degradation. Once again, they just, like, cross-play their East Coast example everywhere here, insofar as they can see that there's, like, going to be, like, cities, sprawled up cities, because their affirmation, they don't want one big city, they want multiple cities. That means there's more emissions from one vehicle to the next because they have to transport between all these regions. They concede this link, which means the environment is way worse under their side of the house. Also, you can extend the fact that healthcare is way better because you have one centralized network. Even though there might be, like, less access in rural areas, insofar as most people live in the urban areas, you need to cater to the majority of the population first. Obviously, there will be hospitals everywhere else, but insofar as the hospitals are probably awash, and environment gets extended, and we get the impacts of, like, billions of dollars, like, of lives lost due to climate change, vote off.
Alright, our off-time roadmap, just going to be doing some non-voters and the voters. Is anybody not ready? My time begins in 3, 2, 1. To the point at which side government still does not give you a reason why actively discouraging the formation of primate cities is good, I am so proud to oppose. Let's start with some places that you are not going to be voting in today's debate round. I want you to first look at this idea of cultural and economic divide. We put a lot of ink on this part. We tell you that time and time again that overall cities are massive ethnic hubs with the example of Nairobi, and this turns any point of political clash and does not interact with my point that at the end of the day, having this clash is extremely important and good. On the idea of economic divide, they still do not tell us why the housing crisis is anything of a problem, because Shonik articulates to you that high housing prices are an indication that those areas are producing high amounts of economic turnout. You can then look on our case to confirm this, where we tell you that even when they represent less of the population, these primate cities actually develop more of the economic development. From there, you can look at this idea of the population crisis and just immediately know that it's nothing that corresponds to primate cities, because Shonik gives you examples of the contrary, where countries have primate cities but still do not have these population problems. Therefore, it's probably external factors and doesn't win your ballot. The last place to look is this idea of stability, to the point at which we tell you that this is extremely low probability, and even then, it's probably just as bad in the alternative as having a bunch of spread out cities is not very good in a war anyway. You're not voting here. Now we move to what you're looking at. You can probably look easiest at the disadvantage number 2 here on environmental degradation. Why is this the case? We tell you that the environment is one of, if not the biggest impacts in the debate round because of its scope. It affects literally everybody. Billions of people die if we continue to let the problem get worse. They concede that if you have multiple cities, then you have to build transportation networks in between them. And those transportation networks cause emissions. This goes cold conceded and allows for the rise of these PM 2.5 pollution, which leads to respiratory diseases, child development stunts, and overall environmental problems and air degradation. These problems compound into the environmental concerns that lead to billions of deaths, and it would also lead to the health crises that we see in these countries. This is a clean place to vote. But even if you did not want to vote there, there's another clean place on the disadvantage number 1, which is because we told you before that the economic output of these cities is so much higher, and that's why it leads to this foreign development growth. And to the extent that they drop this World Bank quote, which confirms to you that these multinational corporations are unwilling to go into a country unless it has a primate city, then you can buy with 100% strength of link that you are never going to be able to get, that you are going to have this mass poverty effect if you vote government. Because as we tell you since the beginning, a 1% drop in GDP growth pushes 1.7 million people into extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. And GDP constantly goes down unless you have primate cities which attract this foreign growth. We tell you that when you look back to the Wayne mechanism of what's best for this developing country, and the developing country is not the United States of America, this developing country wants to see foreign growth in it. It wants to see a clean environmental landscape. And the only way to do that is with these primate cities. You can also extend on a lot of their cases idea that the government has quicker response times in primate cities, which is why Seoul was able to respond to COVID so much more accessibly, right? And we just don't see this on their side of the house. So overall, you can buy that these disasters that they try to go for are not going to happen because the government has an ability to respond quickly in primate cities. And then you can look at the fact that on the side of opposition, we cleanly get access to foreign development in this debate round, which leads to increased GDP growth, and without it, you push millions of people into poverty, which is bad for the net benefits of this country. And then furthermore, we tell you that even if you don't want to look there, having to have increased transport systems and having to have a redundant infrastructure only leads to worse environmental effects, which triggers the scenario of billions of people dying. We tell you the magnitude and probability of these are on the net, both much higher than that of my opponents, which is why I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, it will basically all be clash. Let me just... Okay, my time begins in 3, 2, 1. I think the most important point in this round is all about stability. In that we're talking about a developing country that is first getting its, sea legs out in the sea and basically becoming this international body. We must focus on stability first, in that it links into every single other issue in this round. In that it's a developing country, we don't want it to collapse in 50 years. We don't want it to collapse in 100 years. We want it to be around so everyone can have benefits overall. If you still have a country in 50 years, you can make efforts towards climate change, you can make efforts towards fixing the economy and healthcare and all these other issues, but if you don't have that, then you never get to solve any of the issues in this round. Okay, first on the economy. We see what
Point of order.
mischaracterizes here.
We're just going to call a point of order just in case, but I think the argument that stability is the internal linker just comes for every other argument in the round is very new and very abusive in the PMR.
Well, this is just weighing. It's this is most important because it does everything else.
Judge's discretion.
Yeah, it's panel.
Okay, my time. 3, 2, 1. Okay, then on the economy, what Ott mischaracterizes here is that you can still have urban cities, which I said in my PMC, in our world. We're just making sure that we're not going to have one specific city. We can develop many other cities. We can develop suburban areas. We can develop rural areas as well. We see that this happens in the US as a really key example of this, where you can have a developing country and still have multiple cities. And when the USA was developing, it wasn't just New York City, it was Boston, it was Philadelphia, it was all these other urban hubs where there was still development, where people were still investing in these cities, and actually you got more specialized industry coming out of it in the first place. Extend what Anya Anya tells you in MG, where you have cities like LA then that are very specialized in one industry, and New York City, which is like a finance capital, LA, like film industry, for example, where you can then specialize and have actually more of an appeal on an international scale because you're so specialized in one industry, and then you interact with more foreign investors in the future, which is ultimately better. In fact, what's more important here is that they drop the Vietnam argument that they make in their first speech. Why do they do this? They do this because Anya tells you in her speech that when that Vietnam that has, I don't know, I believe it was 17% of their GDP linked to Ho Chi Minh, as soon as there's tariffs on Vietnam from Trump, which we see happening in the status quo, you nuke that 17% of their GDP and essentially hurt every single person living in their economy. Extend their own analysis they give you about how even 1% drop in GDP leads to millions of deaths overall. This leads to so much impact when you aren't able to be a stable country. Okay, then on who's actually getting the money in the first place, we see that there's such a divide in who's actually making all of this money in their world. They talk about these primate cities and how much money they're making and how much GDP they're making, but who's actually making this money? It's only the people in those urban areas, those cosmopolitan areas, not everyone else in the entire country. You lead to less development in the rural areas, and those people cannot access any of the sort of welfare or any good programs in their world. That's ultimately bad under the way mechanism of utilitarianism, in that their happiness is not actually thought about in the opposition world.
Sorry. This idea that, so in the LOC we bring up this idea that these cities produce more economically, but we never got this articulation that only the people in the cities experience the benefit as a result of that. And there were
This is on our divide.
But this was the link that I gave you, was that the reason people move to the cities is because it's the only place to experience social mobility. That's an extension.
Yeah, it's a weighing on the divide point. Okay. Then on the geography point, Op basically knifes their own case when they concede that migration occurs in large rates. Not everyone can settle just in the city. They talk about Seoul and how people can commute to Seoul, but what we see happening more so in a city like Seoul is that people are settling in the small places that they can find homes in, where it is too small for them to have children, be able to essentially put down roots, and we see that leads to lessening birth rates. Extend what Anya tells you, where we see that in China, 3/4 of the decline in population happened before you even had any policy pushed in the first place. This is really bad because if you don't have enough young people in your country in the first place, you're never going to survive 50 years from now, especially if you don't have any migration happening. Migration happens in some places, not every place, so we can't really weigh on this. We see that it doesn't always happen in developing nations. Okay, then on healthcare and climate change, we see that you have more areas on our side where you have more suburban areas and other cities where you can then access more healthcare. They basically just concede this point where they say, oh, we care about the primate city more because there's more people there. I believe we should care about everyone, that they all have equal access to healthcare, in that if you're waiting 8 hours that you have to then drive in a rural area to then get access to healthcare, you're more likely to have people dying in those areas rather than having an even spread of 3 hours overall everywhere in the country, which is ultimately better. Climate change is a wash in that you have more emissions in a heavily industrialized area, which happens more on their side of the house. Then on this idea of time frame, which is ultimately the most important thing,
Point of order. Yeah. Any response to climate change or emissions based on distance or the fact that there's just more emissions in your world? There's not. Emissions wasn't even responded to in the MG. So.
Emissions were brought up she said that there is more heavily industrialized places in your world, thus there's more emissions. And then also the point on access to healthcare, it was the whole ideology that you can drive to the place and you have 3 hours to drive there.
So just do it.
Okay. I'm gonna resume my time in 3, 2, 1. Then let's just talk about time frame. You want to have a developing nation that is going to exist in the future, and that only happens on our side of the house when you have more stability, when you aren't going to get your entire country nuked by one tariff, when you aren't going to have your entire country get depopulated because of an aging population, where you're able to develop more, you're able to access all their impacts when you have stability.
Good round, guys. Thank you so much. Good round. Thank you so much.
We'll go for a
We'll go outside.
might be. Take your time. No rush.
Good round, everyone. Congrats to breaking a THC. Pretty sick. It's a 3-0 for the neg. I'll go first. I think the stability point of order matters a lot, and I think I resolved it in favor of the app. I think even if there is any link here, I can interpret this as basically reversibility weighing, that state collapse is final, but the economy can solve for later, which I think is a pure weighing claim, and that's good enough for me to put stability on top, even if independently the specific link of state collapse being, or the specific link between state collapse and solving the economy later would be new. I don't think they need that link. What is stability? To me, it's state collapse. I don't think Vietnam could possibly link it to stability because the impact is still GDP. If I thought that GDP linked it to stability, I would evaluate the neg. Maybe I should just evaluate the negative here, and I end up basically like thinking there's just parallel links into the economy everywhere, and I'm not going to evaluate it, and I have better ways of resolving for stability. First of all, I think demographic collapse is probably state collapse. It's work, but it's certainly stability. I think the PMR dropped the alt-positive Asian culture, which takes out all their warrants, and the sub-Saharan Africa warrant, so I think the app is probably bad for demographics. They also dropped the more people that will have sex in more concentrated areas turn, so the app is very bad for demographics. The app is also losing the cosmopolitanism for on politics, which is still stability, because that is still antagonist versus advantage. Thus, I think the app is still stability, and I vote neg. On the econ, like, I don't know, everyone discusses warrants. On the, like, environment, I think the industrialization term with the Seoul word attached was indeed in the MD, so it's still everyone has parallel links.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I would add, like, I was confused a lot around exactly what was being argued. At times, it seemed like the Gov was arguing that there shouldn't be rural areas at all, that everything should just be urbanized. The examples from the US weren't particularly helpful because it's not a direct analogy. I would have preferred examples from China or India or Brazil or some other developing country that you could point to that says, look, there's investment in multiple places, and then have an argument about whether that's good or bad or applicable to smaller countries as well as bigger countries. But given what was discussed in the round, it really came down to me, the warrants about the World Bank investment in GDP and the ability for Korea to act quickly on events like the coronavirus response, because everyone being so centralized. There were definitely good arguments about people feeling that they have no choice, that they have to move to the cities. But I don't know how the Gov solves for that, and the op didn't really attack it either, so that I kind of had to leave that a little unresolved, more towards the Gov side. But then also the ops counter with what happened with Nigeria's program didn't get really responded to, so that sort of brought me back to them.
I also voted for the op, but I thought you guys all did a great job.
Yeah, second that.
Agree with everything the other judges have said, and I think at the end of the day, for me, it was in the close that some of the last points that the opposition had made needed to get responded to, and I didn't hear the answers I needed to hear.
Thank you guys
Thank
for
you
putting
guys.
your
Thank you,
time
Judge.
together.
Great round.